bridges. But in these tough economic times, when the state is already cutting local aid, you know how the governor intends to pay for these repairs? He intends to pay for them with tax increases and by borrowing another $9 billion, thereby adding to the state's more than $19 billion worth of debt. Now, I don't know about you, but I think we're already taxed enough here in Massachusetts. I don't like much the idea of passing and giving in further debt and larger sums of it to future generations. And as a Republican, I wish I could simply say that it's the Democrats' fault. That certainly would make a lot of these elections a lot easier. But the truth is, at least at the federal level, Republicans are as much to blame for our nation's crippling debt as the Democrats are. For far too long, Republicans in Congress spent as though they were Democrats, and as a result of that, the American public lost confidence in our party, and our image of fiscal responsibility was tarnished. And while that image was being tarnished, do you know what Republicans in Congress did? They passed Medicare Part D without finding a way to fund it. They took us to 2 wars without seeing if the Treasury could afford it. And they deregulated the markets to the point where agencies such as AIG and Goldman Sachs were allowed to grow so large that when they began to fall under the weight of their own debt and poorly hedged bets, they were deemed too big to fail. And so instead, you and I were left picking up the tab. And time again, it's the same story, whether you're Republican or you're Democrat. Hey, Detroit, you're making a car that the market doesn't want, no problem. Uncle Sam's gonna bail you out. What's that, airlines? You've got too many seats on those half-empty planes? That's okay, we'll give you some money too. Hello, Wall Street, you didn't realize that economies need tangible goods, but how about a rescue package? Oh, and don't worry about it, we'll look the other way while you give your incompetent management golden parachutes and bonuses in the billions of dollars. Well, my friends, to borrow a line from our president, enough. The only difference is I mean it when I say it, and I know you all do too. And that's why we're here today. We're here today to tell Washington that enough does mean enough. To tell our elected leaders that we'll no longer sit idly by and watch our tax dollars be handed over to over-leveraged multinationals. To tell our elected leaders that debt is a serious problem plaguing our cities, our states, and our country. Now, some of you would say that I'm being overly dramatic, of course, about this topic of debt. But let there be no doubt about it. The habitual practice of borrowing money to fund otherwise unfunded mandates is dangerous, to say the least. Greece has shown us as much, as it's grappled with a debt-to-GDP ratio of more than 120%. Now, that might seem like a lot, but remember I told you a little bit before, America's debt currently exceeds in excess of 87% of GDP. Now with Greece could rely on countries such as France and Germany and institutions such as the IMF and the EU to bail them out, but it's come at a hefty price. As a condition of these bailouts, Greece has lost near total control of its own budget and fiscal policies. Worse still is that it appears that a number of EU countries are disturbingly close to defaulting too. Countries such as Spain and Portugal, perhaps Italy, and if Britain isn't careful, they're going to be following too. In an effort to prevent further economic contagion from Greece, the EU has adopted unprecedented measures which have included a $1 trillion bailout for their much-loved euro. Now, regardless of whether or not it's the right thing that the Germans and French foot the bill for the Greeks and others, the larger question is, will it actually work? What happens if Portugal follows Greece's lead, then Spain? Who bails these countries out? And Italy and Britain? Who can save them? How can you? I mention this not to cause panic, but to raise awareness. Europe is in dire straits. They are learning quite painfully that there are limits to the size of the state, that the state cannot borrow and spend endlessly because eventually the bill will come due. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying I'm opposed to government spending for the sake of being opposed. In fact, on issues such as education and defense, we understand that some spending is necessary. The debate, however, is how should our taxes be and how do they spend the money? Recently, I was visiting a friend of mine in England. He's doing some work for the Conservative Party. Now, in full disclosure, this friend of mine is a registered Democrat, and he is an American citizen. But he's been living in England for the past 4 years, working on a PhD, and while he was showing me around the neighborhood, he was pointing out how nearly every house in that neighborhood had new windows and new doors. These houses, he informed me, are what they call council houses. Now, they are provided by the government to people who are below the poverty level. Now, my friend very much liked the idea that Britain was serious about tackling the issue of homelessness. He informed me that the council houses have only exacerbated the problem of poverty. This is because in the UK there is no limit to the size of the welfare state. For instance, since the Labour Party came into power in 1997, some 3 million Brits who are otherwise capable of working have never held a job in their life. Instead, what all too often happens is at 16 years old, girls, instead of being encouraged to attend a university or a college, are told to get pregnant instead. As the more dependents someone has in Great Britain, the more money they get from the government and the larger their council house is. Under this system, the British government has effectively eliminated any incentive which a youth might have to reach for the stars in search of a dream, instead passively encouraging them to have a life of poverty and sloth. Moreover, the rising number of citizens who now depend upon government handouts and subsidies is quickly becoming an albatross around Britain's sinking net. So again, Europe is learning that there must be limits to the size of the state. Equally, however, we in America, after years of deregulation, we too are learning that there is indeed a role for government to play, but that we can't have a government that is so large and one that is not for the people, by the people, and of the people. The problem is that the government we've got today has been so perverted by corporate money that the interests of banks and multinational corporations reign supreme. This is a problem which is acknowledged by both the left and the right. Unfortunately, however, politicians typically operate in the environment of winning the next election rather than focusing on what needs to be done to make things happen for our people. And we, the people, well, unfortunately, folks, we're a little bit to blame too. For too many of us, for far too many of us, far too many years, we've gotten lazy in our intellectual pursuits. We preferred pundits to experts. We preferred talking points to factual journalism. And this is a dangerous development for our American society and for American politics. With increasing vigor, our news outlets are rapidly adopting partisan slants which seek to convince that the supporters of one political party are our enemy. I'm here to tell you that's not the case. I am a Republican, I'm proud of that. But I don't consider the Democrats to be my enemy. They're wrong more often than they're right, but they're not my enemy. And so it is that we seek to fix the problem and what is wrong with America. We need to accept that such hyper-partisan views must end. The partisan gridlock which plagues Washington today accomplishes nothing but the exacerbation of America's already dire challenges. If Republicans believe that Democrats will not return the favor in kind when we again find ourselves in the majority, then we are sadly deluding ourselves. What we need is a country for both parties to stand up. We need Democrats and Republicans talking to one another, debating one another, ultimately engaging one another in genuine dialogue where the validity of ideas and arguments are open freely and laid forth for all to judge. We need a political environment where politicians do not find themselves in an incessant race to raise money, but where they instead sit down with their peers from across the aisle and enjoy a beer at day's end. Such an environment has been missing for far too long in our political landscape, and it has been detrimental to the American Republic. Can you imagine what would have happened if Thomas Jefferson and John Adams were at each other's throats in Philadelphia in the summer of 1776? The United States would not exist. We'd still be saluting the Queen. But instead, these two men from opposite ends of the political spectrum found it in themselves to put their differences aside and work for the good of the country. And so too, I believe we must. Yes, there will be disagreements, but these can be civil disagreements, and surely all of us, regardless of our political or ideological persuasion, can learn the lessons from Europe now, and the lessons learned in the past 2 years under this president, and come out a better country. For our sake of the future, we cannot allow ourselves to continue down this European path of destruction. I ask you all to please stand up, join together. Let us work to make our government once again a government of the people, by the people, for the people, so we do not perish from this earth. Thank you so much.